Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Sharif Moore of the Drug Free America Foundation, and this is the Pathways to Prevention podcast, where we discuss some of the most innovative and inspiring work being done around the world in substance use prevention, treatment, and recovery. Joining us this morning is child rights activist Pamela McColl, who's been very active in the marijuana policy debate in Canada. Thank you, Pam, for joining us. We're delighted to have you.
Lovely to be here.
Now, could you just, before we get into the policy aspects, can you just talk a little bit about how you came to work in this field?
Sure. I was in New York. I'm a book publisher, and I was working at a book expo event in New York City, and I picked up a copy of Kevin Sabat's book, Reefer Sanity, back in, I think it was 2012, somewhere in there. It was an advanced copy, and I read it on the plane going home, and I just couldn't believe that they were going to repeat the experience of tobacco, that they were using the tobacco playbook, the marijuana industry, to promote marijuana. And I phoned up Kevin Sabat and I discussed the book with him. And then he suggested I start SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana Canada, which I did. And we had Patrick Kennedy come to Vancouver and speak, and we launched the campaign to try and fight against the legalization of Canada, which Justin Trudeau had placed on the agenda for the House of Commons.
And what are some of the negative consequences that you're seeing now in Canada from the legalization of recreational marijuana? Are you seeing any of those population-wide public health consequences that the experts had been warning about?
Well, certainly. I think for myself, because I am a child's rights activist, pregnancy is my focus. And, not only are more women using in pregnancy in Canada, but also in the United States. And, that has, tremendous impact on society going forward from the science that we have, which is, literally pouring off the pages recently. The pregnancy and marijuana risk factors, can no longer be denied by the industry. I mean, the mountain of evidence we have is significant, substantial.
Yeah, it's really quite shocking. Recently, there was a study that came out of Canada that found that women who use marijuana during pregnancy, their children had a higher risk of developing autism, which was quite a
Yes.
shocking and
And
disturbing result.
well, yesterday one came out in the United States, and it was saying that maternal marijuana use actually leads to aggression in children. How sad is that? How sad is that?
Yeah, that
You
that
know,
confirms actually previous research that I've seen that also found that.
right. But the science, as I said, there's a lot of science coming out. There's over 8,800 studies already been funded by NIDA over the years on marijuana and cannabis. But the science we're seeing now just confirms what we saw decades ago. I mean, this is not new news to us. People in the field have known of these risk factors for decades. Way back in the 60s and 70s, you had lead American scientists and elected officials standing at podiums, denouncing marijuana based on science. I mean, this is not something that is a news break here. This is something that we've known about. I think that's what's so shocking, is that we've had this science. And for anybody to say we don't have enough science and let's go ahead and legalize is really kind of upside down thinking. I mean, it's an argument against legalization. If we don't have the science, then we shouldn't. But our argument is we have the science and we shouldn't. So they can't. Either way, it doesn't work to say let's legalize and make it available everywhere, because we know that there's enormous risk factors.
That's right. And actually, I think the biggest difference between now and, the 1970s, when some of those studies were done that you mentioned, is the potency of marijuana has just skyrocketed since then. It's 10 times more potent on average. So in essence, to me, it's a different drug. I don't know if you can even refer to it as marijuana anymore. Really, it's THC.
True enough. That's very true. And the CBD, back in the day, the THC CBD was kind of a balanced in the plant, and one sort of counteracted the other and did other, different things. But No, it's there's a push on right now in Washington, D.C. to try and get, I think, more studies done on the high potency, the consumer drug that they're using, this THC. So we'll see. But we've got enough science on the low potency, to sort of say, put a lid on it. So one can only, gasp at what they're going to find when they start researching the high potency. It's going to be
Yeah.
pretty bad.
And for instance, there's a lot of disturbing reports coming out of states like Colorado on the especially insidious effects it's having on mental health of adolescents. I mean, we've just heard so many reports of mothers who've lost children, to suicide, or they've had psychotic breaks. And the really scary part is they don't seem to bounce back. Once they have that psychotic break, the marijuana, this high potency marijuana, triggers it. It seems to be a lifetime issue from that point in many cases.
True, true enough. The early onset schizophrenia, people who possibly had a genetic predisposition for it, who use marijuana or THC and have early onset schizophrenia, they may have avoided having a full blown schizophrenic, episode or outbreak if they hadn't have used. I think that's very tragic. To get schizophrenia or have it developed in your 20s is completely different than when you're 13. You haven't had your high school education, you haven't had any training, job skills, those kind of things. And I think that's really sad. And the suicide piece, as you mentioned, but suicide is also linked to CBD, so, the Epidiolex study showed that, as does the FDA, and here are all these people using CBD all over the place, so the suicide is certainly a huge issue in the youth population, particularly. Very, very tragic.
So that I'm not familiar with. So CBD is also linked to an increased risk of suicide?
Yes, it is. And I testified at the FDA trials or the hearings regarding this. And I brought forward the science from the Epidiolex studies on CBD, which, if you read the package inserts for that drug, the side effect package insert, it lists suicide as a risk factor. But the FDA also on their website lists it. So, I think that's something that, again, these pregnant women, we have seen an increase in suicide in the pregnant population since 2000 in America. Pregnancy is a time of, emotional difficulties for many women who, for all kinds of reasons, hormonal and also circumstances, and to see an increase in the suicide incidence of pregnant women is, certainly needs to be addressed.
Right. And my understanding is that most pregnant women who are using marijuana, it's to treat nausea, correct?
Well, it's promoted to treat nausea by the industry.
Hmm.
This is what I would call the perversion of the industry, to prey on vulnerable populations and to come up with campaigns that don't have any science behind them, such as, marijuana should be used in pregnancy to alleviate morning sickness. Well, morning sickness is a natural, normal, and healthy sign of a pregnancy. And the very severe forms of vomiting in pregnancy are very rare and need medical attention. But the thing that people seem to forget too is that cannabis cyclical vomiting, is something that one does not want to bring on into a pregnancy. So, the use of marijuana, exactly. So the use of marijuana in pregnancy for morning sickness, is I think the only word for it is twisted.
Yeah.
That the industry would actually promote that, and that women would go along with that. It's twisted. Yeah, it's just, it's this perversion that the industry has in taking topics like this or coming up with campaigns where they think they can go after a market. I mean, it's that they get away with it is absolutely stunning to some of us. Pregnant women need to be told by their doctors, stay away from CBD and stay away from THC. They just need to, the doctors really need to step it up here. I really think they have a role to play here. So, the other thing that's really sad about the pregnancy and the use of THC or CBD, especially THC, is there's a duty to report. So, if you are a woman using and you're pregnant, there's a duty to report in every state in the United States. And they vary, but that can go from a neighbor to a doctor, to a nurse, to a teacher, anybody. A lot of people have the duty to report, and that can have implications for the woman as far as social services being involved, child custody issues. So I think all women need to be told to stay away from THC in pregnancy very strongly.
Absolutely. And in can
And do men. I mean, the male reproductive piece is another huge, discussion that needs to take place in the world. I mean, there's so much science on male use of THC and reproductive health issues, from male, sperm morphology to testicular cancer to, reproductive infertility issues, to DNA damage of their children and their grandchildren. There's so much there. Also, spontaneous abortion, miscarriages, all linked to paternal use of marijuana. So one of the most fascinating things for me was when I testified at the House of Commons for the legalization of marijuana, I brought forward a document that was prepared by Health Canada that said that they listed the reasons why people should stay away from marijuana. And one of the things they said was that men who wish to start a family should not use. This piece of evidence I put forward, and I said, how does the government legalize a drug that they themselves recognize harms male reproductive health? To me, that is so reckless, because most young men don't realize when they're using THC that they could be damaging their reproductive health and potentially making it so they won't be able to have healthy children. I don't think most men know that. I think men deserve to know that. I think it should be on billboards.
I agree with you. I did not know that, at least not to the extent that that you've explained. So how did that happen in Canada that despite the government's own warning, this is still able to proliferate?
Well, having watched pretty well every hour of the testimony in the House of Commons and in the Canadian Senate, the level of corruption in our government that allowed that to happen was pretty shocking. And there were people who were invited to speak at the House of Commons, including Dr. Stuart Rees, who's one of the world authorities on reproductive health and DNA damage, was invited. We got him on the list to be invited to speak. But when they found out what he was going to say, they uninvited him.
Wow.
They didn't let him speak for 10 minutes. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, and
No,
sinister.
very corrupt.
Yeah.
Very sinister. But back in the 1990s, I mean, there were reports coming out of Health Canada that, were, very damaging to the legalization effort, that said, unequivocally that even minuscule amounts of THC were damaging to human health. And the people who wrote those reports were fired and put under gag orders. I've interviewed these people. Like it was a planned, organized, assault on public health, and they got away with it, which is absolutely incredible. And when you looked at the House of Commons and the whole passing of legalization, it was led by the industry. It was led by the industry with people working in the Senate, the Canadian Senate. Dr. Bertha Madras from Harvard, who I'm sure you know who she is, right?
Yeah.
She spoke at the Canadian House of Commons. They went after her on Twitter. They attacked her credibility. The senator's assistants. Dr. Ken Finn testified out of Colorado. Very, very educated, intelligent human being, gave good testimony. They attacked him on Twitter. These are paid assistants from a senator in Canada. That's harassing a witness. It's actually a legal offense, but nothing happened, right? That's what went on. But that's what's going on in America too. I mean, these ballot initiatives, all this money pouring into those, people voting on medicine. I mean, it's all highly suspect. I mean, who votes on a medicine?
Right.
How crazy is that?
I mean, that's not very far removed from voting that crack cocaine is a medicine for narcolepsy. It just boggles the
Yeah.
mind.
Well, yes, and they played on people's compassion. They said it's compassionate, the whole Charlotte's Web and all of that. They played on people's compassion, and the public, because 80% of the people do not use any of these things. The public is not really engaged in it the way some of us are, of course.
Hmm.
But I think the hope down the road is that we only need to agitate that 80% enough to say no on the next ballot initiative. We don't need to revolutionize here. We don't need to activate everybody. We just need to inform everybody enough so that they make the shift, right, to no. So that's what people like myself do, on a daily basis. While we're not doing our jobs, we spend hours as volunteers trying to educate and bring the science forward and have this conversation in America and in Canada and around the world. We're a joint group, and we do not think that the public has been informed, nor have they had the conversation they need to have about drug use and prevention.
There's many that believe that the whole marijuana issue, and it started with, pushing medical marijuana, that this is actually a Trojan horse for broader drug legalization. And you're starting to see that here with the psychedelics, and possibly now the next step will be even harder drugs.
Well, sure. I think it's not only other drugs, it's also a political campaign. I think that, the whole movement, the marijuana movement, is also the cannabis culture, and it's very anti-authority. It has a political aspect to it that's kind of scary. The undermining of authority in America, I find that kind of eerie, where that's coming from. But, you know, they've pitted sort of, what they did, which I think of everything is probably the most interesting as far as their propaganda strategy, is the Reefer Madness campaign, because they took that film that was never a government film. It was a propaganda. They turned it into propaganda, but originally it was an educational piece, and then it was manipulated by a sort of sleazy underground filmmaker into a drug film, because back in the 30s, you couldn't show drugs in films. It was illegal in the United States. And it was shown on the underground market. But it was discovered in the 1970s by the pushers of marijuana legalization. And they showed it around universities, and it kind of pumped everybody up, right? The Reefer Madness thing. And I don't know if you saw the LA Times a couple of weeks ago, but they even referred to us as Reefer Madness people again. Like, they've used those two words to damage anybody who dares to criticize or comment on their holy weed. I mean, and they've been very effective in doing that. They've made us out to be, draconian, and that's where the politics comes into it too, right? So I think the road ahead, we need to discuss prohibition versus harm reduction. We need to discuss prevention, the history of narcotics, how we've been able to solve things in the past, and we need to, recognize the propaganda in their campaign.
Yes, and as you said, they have been very, very successful in casting, anybody against legalization as part of the whole reefer madness. But the ironic thing is, this is not reefer that we're talking about. This is wax, shatter, dabs. You know, it's not
Yeah, off the end of a vape
off
pen,
the end
all
of.
the vaping and all the, yeah. Well, I've been working recently to try and get people to understand that, there are things one can do. And this is conversation going on right now about what's the role of a parent. How does a parent talk to a teenager? How do you interact and have that conversation if they're vaping and you think they're using THC and they're driving a car? And, the use of drug test kits in the home. How do you do that without sort of eroding any kind of trust issues? How do you do it? And it's been really interesting, because I've read lots of studies on how strong parenting really does help in preventing your kids from using drugs. You need to be really strong in your messaging, and I guess in your modeling. You can't sort of be using yourself. It undermines things.
Yeah.
But how do you prevent your kids from getting involved in all of this? And that's really, I think, the primary goal here, is to get less people to use and less youth to use, for sure.
And presumably the parents that are able to be most involved in their lives, um, they have the time to do so, right? In other words, they're not like struggling to make ends meet, working two and three jobs.
Right. Well, it comes your philosophy of parenting too, right? What role you play in that. I was talking to Ed Wood the other day, and he lost his son to a marijuana impaired driver terribly, and he was saying he agreed with me. It's strong parenting. You need to be able to step into the shoes as a parent. I'm a parent. You need to be a parent. You need to say, if you're going to use, you're not having the keys to the family car, and I'm going to test you once a week with these drug test kits. I'm going to randomly test your stuff, because you're not going to harm yourself or kill somebody else and ruin everybody's lives. And I just think that's something a parent needs to step up and do.
That must be a very, an incredibly challenging job, because the culture that you're fighting against is just so powerful, and the peer pressure and all of that. I'm not a parent myself, so I can only imagine.
Right. And as we know, it's peer pressure, like you just said. It's, you know, if someone else is doing it, they want to do it too. If a boyfriend's doing it, the girlfriend will do it. If the other way around, they're all into fitting into their group, and it's pretty hard to stand alone. The one good thing about drug test kits, as with drug dogs in schools, is if you can supply these kids with an excuse, hey, I can't do because the dog's going to know, right? I can't use because, hey, my parents test me every Friday or every Thursday. I never really know when they're coming out, I never really know when they're going to get into my room, It gives the kid an excuse, a way out. You've got to sort of provide some excuses for your kids. I love the drug dog story. I think that this little boy came up to a head mistress who I knew, and said, "Yeah, I like the dogs. Keep the dogs here, in the school, because I can, say that. I can say, hey, no, I'm not doing that because that dog's going to snip it in my backpack, So, but no, it's definitely challenging times. And as you mentioned, a lot of parents, everybody's busy. I mean, everybody's busy. We've all gone to a 10-second, minute sort of thing. It's like
Right.
we're really busy people.
Are you familiar
These
with
things get
Dr. Gabor Mate? He's from Vancouver.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
he has a very interesting take on addiction, and I think he's right about a lot of things. And one of the things he said was that if you want to prevent a child from using drugs, well, he said that it's of utmost importance for a child to be surrounded by nurturing, supportive adults when they're growing up, because then they will bond with those adults and identify with those adults rather than the peer group. And that's typically, a situation, more of like you would find in extended families, which is not, the typical Western situation, but it's definitely food for thought.
I'm a grandmother just as of a month ago. I think
Congratulations.
grandparents have yeah, thank you. I think grandparents have an enormous place in this conversation. I not only, I'm 63, so I grew up and went to high school during the big drug boom in the 70s. I understand some of this. I think they have a huge role to play. And as you said, a lot of parents are busy, but a grandparent could certainly step into this role. And someone said to me the other day, they were sort of jokingly said to me, what are you going to do if your granddaughter smokes, pot or does pot? And I went, she won't be. She just won't be. I'll make it my mission. And you certainly can't Teflon your kids. There's no way in the world I can say 100% that little girl will not use drugs. But I know I have an active role to play, and I will do it. I will show up for that role. As of course will my daughter. But I just think, the other big thing is that when we look at narcotics history and we look at how we've sort of brought rates of use down before, it's always been through observational damage, which is the process of linking damage to the cause. And this is our problem, is that these kids don't understand the risks. I mean, look what we've just discussed about male reproductive health, testicular cancer, and marijuana. They don't link these things together. If they did, they might think again. Even with peer pressure, they might think again. And so how does a parent, or how does anybody, present the science to a child? Tricky.
Yeah.
Because there's so much out there, right? How do you do that? How do you get them to believe it? I think a good way to circle back to all this is come back to driving, because it's a tangible. You are given the keys to the car. You are high. You drive. You are going to possibly hurt someone, pedestrian, cyclist, passenger, yourself, or someone else's vehicle. And that's a more tangible. I think they'll understand that better than possibly, the risk of testicular cancer. So, and so I think that's a good place for parents to start with the driving issue, and we have all the stats, we have lots and lots of science on how it impairs driving and from speed to everything else. So I think that's a good place to start.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because I've thought about that. What would be the most effective way to reach an adolescent? I mean, and it seems like the science-based argument rather than the moralistic one would be more effective. But, as you mentioned, it would be challenging to, explain some of the more complex concepts, and then, outcomes that are more remote, that aren't part of their reality, like testicular cancer or.
Right. And it comes with this and it comes with odds. It doesn't, not everybody, of course.
Yeah.
Just like tobacco. Not everybody's going to die from using tobacco. 50% premature death. Not everybody. There's an out. So I think I think the driving is certainly, and I think the other thing about the driving and marijuana is so important to have this conversation is that it affects the non-user. It affects the pedestrian, the cyclist, as I mentioned. Everybody's exposed to this, not just the users. Every single person listening to this, could possibly be killed or hurt, or someone they love, by a marijuana impaired driver. And I have lots of friends who have, deceased children because of a marijuana impaired driver. Many of them have gone on to become advocates and work, very hard on this campaign, which must be very painful. But they do it because they really don't want this to have to, occur to some of their family. So, but there's so many pieces of this. It's not just driving. I think that the pregnancy, the reproductive health, the mental health issues, as you mentioned, psychosis, cancers. I mean, there's just liver. Look at CBD and liver function. Nobody should be using CBD unless you have a liver function test. Look at all the people who drink alcohol, use CBD. Where's that heading? Not good. So there's all kinds of things, heart attack and stroke with THC, all kinds of issues. But I think when you look at the science and, you sort of wonder how to educate yourself, the Surgeon General is probably a really good place to start, because the Surgeon General of the United States doesn't speak unless what they utter has been vetted and vetted and vetted. It is as good as it gets. And when they stand up and say pregnant women should not use, you can take that to the bank. The Surgeon General cannot say things that aren't backed in evidence-based, great science. And so I think that's a really good place to go. And, how much science do we need? This is the other question. I mean, we have the risk of low birth weight with maternal use of pregnancy of THC. We have that science. It's substantial science, which has been verified by the National Academy of Science and Technology. So what else do we need, folks? Because low birth weight is the number one cause of infant death. What do we need? How much more do we need? Look how big the population, the pregnant population, or the reproductive years are for a woman, 18 to 50. Males, much more. We've got it. that's the piece. That's all we really need, is that causes low birth weight. That's what I feel, at least. I think we have so many studies right now going on about the use of marijuana in pregnancy, but it's kind of, I find it very questionable, because we already have the piece on low birth weight. So why are we looking for more? We've got the piece of gold we need to shut this party down, So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, maybe a lot of people aren't aware of the seriousness of low birth weight, for example, that it is the largest driver of sudden infant death.
Yeah, maybe they don't know that. It's and the risk factor is very high for marijuana. There was a study that just came out with, I think it was 21 million hospital records they analyzed, came out in JAMA last month. And it showed for every single psychological and physiological condition that people had been admitted for while pregnant, those with cannabis use disorder were higher than those without. Every single condition. You saw that,
I
right?
saw that. Yeah, we actually did a blog on that. Yeah, every single psychiatric and medical outcome negative was much higher,
Yes.
significantly higher, statistically significant among the pregnant women with cannabis use disorder. That's right.
Including vomiting.
Yeah.
Including vomiting. There we go, folks. There goes. That's the end of that idea that it's good for morning sickness.
Right.
And more vomiting. Really something. But there's just so much to the story. And I don't know what the future holds. The industry has so much money, and there's so much propaganda, and so many politicians are involved in it too. And you just wonder where we're all headed with this. Can we ever turn this Trojan horse around? Can we ever quell this? And as you said, other drugs coming down the line, from magic mushrooms to all these different things. And it's, where are we headed, folks?
And on that note, I want to thank you so much, Pam, for your time and for all of the work that you did. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope that we can continue to collaborate in the future, and that we'll see you at our next Southeastern Annual Drug Summit in Tampa next year.
Sure, that'd be fun. Okay, I'll do that. Haven't been to Tampa for a while.
Well, thanks again, Pam. It was a delight to have you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next year in Tampa. So thanks again to all of our listeners, and this podcast was brought to you with the generous support of the Adelson Family Foundation. Until next time.